Between December 1989 and November 1990, 7 men who picked up a hitchhiker along Florida's interstate highways turned up dead, shot, robbed, and left in the woods or scrubland off the road. The woman responsible would be branded by the press as America's first female serial killer, a label historians would later argue was more media shorthand than fact, but one that stuck to Aileen Wuornos for the rest of her life and beyond it. Aileen Wuornos is born in Michigan in February 1956 to a mother who abandons her as a toddler and a father she never meets, a man later convicted of child molestation who dies by suicide in prison in 1969, while Aileen is still a teenager. She's raised by her grandparents, who legally adopt her and her brother, and by her own later account, her grandfather is violently abusive and sexually abuses her for years, claims her family disputed, but that she maintained throughout her life and repeated in her final interviews. She becomes pregnant at 14, reportedly after a rape by a family friend, gives the child up for adoption, and is effectively pushed out of the house not long after. By some accounts, she's already trading sex for money, food, and cigarettes among neighborhood boys years before that. Her grandmother dies of liver failure when Wuornos is 15, and afterward she drops out of school entirely and begins supporting herself full-time through sex work along Florida's highway corridors, a life she continues on and off for roughly 2 decades, moving through a string of arrests for offenses ranging from disorderly conduct to armed robbery. In 1986, at a gay bar in Daytona Beach, she meets Tyria Moore, a hotel maid, and the two become partners and eventually live together in a string of motels, with Wuornos largely supporting them both through solicitation. Here's the detail that complicated the case from the very first victim. Richard Mallory, the man Wuornos shot in December 1989, turns out to have a previous conviction for rape and had served 10 years in prison for it, a fact investigators and Wuornos' own defense would seize on to argue her claim of self-defense. It's the only one of her 7 cases with any documented history suggesting the victim might have posed a real threat, and it becomes the seed of a self-defense narrative Wuornos maintains on and off for years, one that gets far harder to sustain as 6 more bodies turn up, none of them tied to any comparable history. Over the following 11 months, Wuornos kills 6 more men she meets while soliciting along the highway. David Spears, a heavy equipment operator, Charles Carskadden, a hay hauler engaged to be married, Troy Burris, a delivery driver reported missing by his employer within hours, Charles Dick Humphreys, a 56-year-old retired Air Force major and former police chief who spent his final years investigating child abuse for the state of Florida, Walter Geno Antonio, a security guard and reserve police officer himself, and Peter Seams, a 65-year-old missionary whose car is later found crashed and abandoned, but whose body is never recovered. In each case, her method is largely the same. She shoots the men, usually multiple times at close range, takes their cash, jewelry, and belongings, and either dumps the body in dense brush off the highway or abandons the vehicle miles away. She and Moore pawn several of the victim's possessions, tools, car parts, a diamond ring, under their own names at shops across 2 counties, a decision that will prove to be the single biggest mistake of the entire spree. When Peter Siems's abandoned car is spotted after a minor traffic accident in July 1990, witnesses give police a description of two women seen fleeing the scene on foot, leading to composite sketches that run on local news for weeks. It's not the sketches that crack the case, though. It's the pawn shop paperwork. A thumbprint left on a ticket for a pawned item is traced back to Aileen Wuornos through a prior arrest record. And by January 1991, police have identified both her and Tyria Moore and begun quietly building a case. Rather than arrest Moore, investigators offer her immunity in exchange for cooperation, move her to a hotel under police protection, and have her call Wuornos from a monitored line over several days. In those recorded calls, investigators steer Wuornos, still not in custody and unaware Moore is cooperating, toward statements that edge close to a confession, largely because Wuornos keeps trying to reassure Moore she'll take all the blame herself and protect her from being implicated. Wuornos is arrested at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Port Orange on January 9, 1991, initially on an outstanding weapons charge unrelated to the murders, and within days confesses to all 7 killings in a lengthy taped statement, framing each one as self-defense against a client who turned violent or attempted to rape her. Wuornos stands trial for the Mallory murder first in January 1992, and despite her self-defense testimony, is convicted and sentenced to death. The jury unpersuaded that a pattern of 7 killings could all have been self-defense, and largely unaware at trial of how thin the corroborating evidence was for any case but this first one. Facing 5 more capital cases that same year, she pleads no contest to 3 additional murders specifically to avoid further trials, telling the court she wanted to save the state the expense and get right with God, and in 1993 pleads guilty to the remaining 2, receiving a death sentence for each, 6 death sentences in total, since the Siems case, with no body ever found, is never separately charged as murder. In interviews over the following decade, her account shifts repeatedly, sometimes reasserting self-defense, sometimes flatly admitting the killings were about robbery, and her mental state visibly deteriorates on death row, including public claims that prison officials were beaming voices and controlling her mind through the walls of her cell. Despite documented competency concerns raised by her own legal team in her final months, Florida Governor Jeb Bush signs her death warrant, and Aileen Wuornos is executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002 at Florida State Prison, having spent close to a decade on death row. Wuornos became one of the most heavily documented killers in American media, the subject of 2 Nick Broomfield documentaries filmed years apart that captured her deteriorating mental state in real time, and the basis for the 2003 film Monster, in which Charlize Theron's performance won an Academy Award. The first female serial killer, framing that defined her media coverage, has since been widely challenged by criminologists who point to a documented history of female serial killers going back well over a century. A reminder that the label said as much about press appetite for a novel narrative as it did about the historical record, and about how differently the public and the justice system have long processed violence from women versus violence from men. If you want the next case file, subscribe. New files unlock every Tuesday.